start using your dots, and that's where you set priorities across all these different things that we could be doing. Which impacts do you think that we should be spending our time on? And you can put your dots on those sections across all these boards around the room. We'll wrap it up and get you out of here as close to 8:25 or 8:30 as we possibly can. Methow time. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Amy Snover. She also has a place in the Methow Valley, and her family, I think, is here tonight. She's the director of the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, and also director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and an affiliate associate professor of UW School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. Amy works to connect science and decision-making to tackle today's pressing environmental challenges. She aims to support the development of regional resilience, that's us here, to climate variability and change by harnessing science to address the real needs of resource managers, planners, policymakers, and communities. I've had the opportunity to work with Amy over the years, and most recently she brought a huge amount of really focused expertise to the Orca task force as we were trying to look forward to say, how is the climate impacts going to affect the ability of the ecosystem to support the southern resident orcas in our region, which everybody cares a lot about. And her knowledge and her incisiveness and expertise is really first rate, and we're very lucky that she's here tonight to provide this expertise to guide us and kick us off on this process. So without further ado, Snover.
You guys are invisible. Just a bunch of black heads. Gosh, this is exciting. Look at how many people are here. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you, everyone in this room, for coming out tonight. This is the challenge of our time, and we need all hands on deck to deal with it. So, and I am particularly happy to be here because I have chosen this line of work because it is all about how we are affecting our home and how we can make our home to be what we want it to be. And my way of trying to do that is to bring science to support your decision making, to help you understand what we see in front of us, and to help us think through what the implications of various response options are so that we can have the future we want. Go ahead. So this has already been mentioned, but I'm going to say it again. It's really important to think about dealing with climate change as sort of the two sides of the same coin. And we can't do one without the other. So first of all, the most important thing in my mind is that we address the root cause. And that means reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That means that we stop making the problem worse. Unfortunately, we have already set change in motion, and there are many changes that have unfolded already, and many more that are going to come. Succinctly, things are going to get worse before they get better. And so we need to be also preparing for the consequences, because the better we are prepared for those changes, the better we'll be able to deal with them. And so as both Mark and Jasmine mentioned, this first stage of the process here is really talking about preparing for the consequences, developing resilience, and that is what my expertise is into, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about. Next slide. So I just want to tell you, for those of you who don't know my group, who we are and why I'm up here talking about this at all. So I represent the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, and we've been working since 1995 to translate big, global, big climate change science into very local specific impacts and information that can be used in planning and decision making. And so we have a mission, which is to build climate resilience by advancing understanding, awareness, and action around climate risks. And we work closely with public and private entities to apply this information as they act to shape our future. Because everywhere around the state, everywhere in every community, people are making decisions now in our name with our resources that will determine our future vulnerability or resilience to climate change. And my goal is that all of those decisions are made with the best information possible about the future that we face so that we can build the world we want. So go ahead. So tonight I'm just going to talk about three major things. I'm going to do a really quick overview of how much our climate has already changed, and that's mostly talking about the Washington State or Pacific Northwest. I'm going to talk about what's expected for the future in general terms for Washington State, and then some more specific data for the Methow Valley. And then I'm going to talk about what our neighbors are doing, because there's actually a huge amount of action on preparing for climate change. There is a lot of work being done, which will hearten you because you depend on all of those people. And it also might add some urgency because there's a lot more to do. So go ahead, I'm going to start with how much our climate has already changed. So the average year now in the Northwest is 1.5 degrees warmer than it was during the first half of the 20th century. Go ahead. In addition, we're seeing a pattern of warming that is showing increasing warming during cold times versus warm times. So the coldest day of the year is already is about 5 degrees warmer than it was earlier in the century. Go ahead. The frost-free season is now 16 days longer. The snowpack in the Cascades has decreased about 25% between the mid-20th century and 2006. I think the latest updated numbers are around 30% decrease in Cascades snowpack end of the year totals. As a result of decreased snowpack and increased temperatures, we're seeing that the peak timing, the timing of peak streamflow from snowmelt influenced rivers is occurring up to 20 days earlier in many rivers in the Northwest. And the number of large fires and area burn have both increased in the Northwest since about the mid-70s. And this is evidence in large part due to observed increases in the dryness of fuels. So this is a good point for me to remind all of us that all of these changes that have been observed result from a combination of factors. They're in part caused by human-caused climate change. They are in part caused by natural variability in climate, and in situations like when we talk about fire, and you all know this as much as I do, they're in part caused by past management decisions about how we managed our forests. So every one of these trends has a mixture of factors causing it. And the one factor that is our influence on climate change is only going to get bigger. So those trends are going to continue in those directions, while we still have natural climate variability that's going to bounce us around, and we'll have some good years and bad years and dry years and wet years and cooler years and warmer years along the way. Okay, so now I'm going to transition into what's expected for the future and what's expected for the future for the Northwest. Go ahead. And I'm going to do it at a broad overview. First of all, thinking about what are the major changes in climate, the physical climate that we inhabit, and then I'll get into how are those changes likely to unfold on the landscape. So let's be clear, every single scenario shows tells us to expect increased warming, right? There's not a single plausible version of the future that does not have continued warming. And so this next slide will show you specifically what that looks like. So this is a graph that you probably can't read the details from the back of the room, but I will talk you through them. So this is showing temperature relative to the average over the second half of the 20th century. So that's that black line, is the 1950 to 99 average. And the year is across the bottom, the 1950 on the left and 2100 on the right. And the gray is the observed climate in the second half of the 20th century. And this is for Washington State, okay? So you can see the warming that was occurring in the second half of the century, and then you can see two scenarios going forward, a blue one and a red one. And there's some really squiggly lines, and those are the individual examples of what the future could be. And then there's some darker lines, and those are the averages of all of this across the scenarios. So when people ask me the question, well, how much is it going to warm and how fast is it going to warm? I have to say, well, I don't know, because I don't know what we as a society are going to choose to do. Because the amount of warming, in a large part, depends on societal choices about energy use and ultimately all the things that drive greenhouse gas emissions. So the way we give information for people to use is we often give multiple scenarios. And so that blue line, which is the low one that shows not a whole lot of warming, It shows that in the 2050s in eastern Washington, it'll be about 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was in about the 1970s. 4.6, I shouldn't round up because that's why it's different, right? So then the red line shows that in the 2050s in eastern Washington, it'll be about 6 degrees warmer, and there's a range around each of those what it could be. And so the important thing is that they're both warming, right? We can't get away from that. Another important thing is that in both of those scenarios, when you look at the 2050s, the average is warmer than the warmest years of the 20th century. So in either case, we're going to a new world. And then, as you look further in the century, the trajectories really diverge, and that's where our choices really show their importance about how much change we expect. So again, rapid warming is expected. Go ahead. So the other changes that we expect as a result of climate change are we expect heavier rainfall. We don't expect more precipitation, much more precipitation on average over the year, just a tiny bit more. But we expect that when it rains hard, it'll rain harder. Or when it rains, the big heavy rains will come more frequently. So then as a result of these, we have some other impacts. Because of warming, we expect less snow, we expect it to melt earlier, we expect stream flows to change as a result. We don't care about sea level rise over here, but some of you might care about sea level rise over there. And that is going to continue. And on top of it, we will see natural variability all the time. Okay? So, warming, heavier rainfall, sea level rise, which I'm not going to talk about. The next part of the talk is how do those changes unfold? How will they cascade through our watersheds in our region? So the main way, what we termed about 20 years ago, the dominant impact pathway through which climate change will affect a lot of the western US, and in particular here, is through changes in snowpack, because we care about it for our water, our recreation, and our ecosystems. And we have pretty low mountains here in the Northwest, and a large percentage of the snow there is near snow line. So one of the main impacts of warming is less snow. And so I'm going to show you a series of maps that show changes in April 1st water in the snowpack, April 1 snow water equivalent, over this century under a sort of medium emission scenario. So for the 2020s, we expect about a 30% decrease in April 1 snowpack. For the 2040s, 45% decrease, and by the 2080s, about a 65% decrease. And this is under an emission scenario that's kind of in between the blue one and the red one. And you can see that on these maps, the reddest places are where the snow is lost. It's lost in the low elevation southern places first, and essentially retreats up the hillsides. So the next, okay, so here's just a summary for people who don't want maps, who want numbers. Under this same scenario, and this is actually aggregated over the Methow Valley from our coarse hydrologic model that doesn't tell you about what's happening at every single elevation band that you might care about. But in general, we expect about a 20% decrease in the 2040s and a 46% decrease by the 2080s in this April 1st snowpack for the Methow. Those are lower numbers than for the state as a whole, and that's because the mountains in this watershed tend to be higher / colder, and so less sensitive to the early stages of warming. The snow season, which we define in a specific way for math, on this one I can tell you later, decreases the length of the snow season, expected to decrease significantly as well. So now, one of the major impacts in this one trickles through everything that we care about is really about how that affects our stream flow. And so I'm going to be particularly here focused on the Methow, but this is super important for the Columbia and many other watersheds here. So this is a figure that shows stream flow. That's what the line is charting. Month of the year, and it starts in October because that's when the water year starts. I don't know if you knew there was a water year. There's academic years, calendar years, fiscal years, water years. There's other years that I don't know about. So October, and typically this is for the Methow River watershed above Twist. So typically it's not high stream flow, October, November, January, February, you know this, right? And then when the snow melts though, there's the peak flows April, May, June, and then July, August, September it drops off again when the snow is done melting. And so climate change, it sort of changes this in the sense that we expect more winter rains, because it'll be raining instead of snowing because at the middle elevations, because it's warmer. We expect that those peak flows will be earlier because there's less snow, it'll melt faster, and it's warmer. And then we expect less summer snow melt. And so I used the same eye, this is the royal eye, I didn't do this, my team did, use the same information that was on those maps to then calculate how streamflow will change over the century. So we see in the 2020s these changes beginning to happen with the increased winter flows, slightly earlier peak flows. The 2040s, that's hard to see, it's not a whole lot more change there. And then the 2080s. And for here, the biggest changes percentage-wise would be the increased flows in the fall, winter. The decreased summer stream flows are particularly problematic for many managed uses. This is a less sensitive hydrograph than many other river basins in the state, again, because there is a significant proportion of the higher polar mountain snowpack. Okay, so if you want just the short take-home thing about water, just remember less water when you want it and more water when you don't. That's the way climate change is pushing us. So we expect more winter flows, higher peak flows, higher floods in many cases, the ones that are driven by by rain, and then decreases in summer flows and in low flows in the river. Okay. Oh, my animation didn't work. It gave you the secret answer already. Okay. All right, why don't you click it one more time and then we'll get the middle picture. Okay, so another consequence, right, then is warming streams. So with warmer air temperature and alone, we expect the high temperatures in our streams to be higher. And so typically August is the hottest time of the year for our streams. That is when we often look at what the stream temperatures are with concern over cold water fish and migration. And so these are some maps of the Methow watershed. You can see Winthrop and Twist showing on the left historic. This is a stream network. So you can see the streams in all the colors. And it's color-coded so that yellow, orange, and red streams are 18 degrees Celsius or above. It depends on your salmon species and where it is. The numbers are different in different places, but you can roughly think of 18C as a temperature when it starts to impede migration. Okay, so this is sort of historic, looking over the last 20 years or so, looking forward to the 2040s and 2080s. And we see about a 10% loss of the number of river miles that are below this 18C threshold. So again, it tends to be mostly the main stems, right? The headwaters and the smaller tribs look like they would stay below that threshold. Okay. Another major driver, of course, of climate impacts in the region is increasing wildfire risk. And we expect that for a variety of reasons, but I mean, we can just think about the length of the snow-free season is longer, and summers will be warmer, which will also add to drier fuel. And so there's been a variety of different studies looking at this, and one of them suggested that in the Columbia Basin in particular, that we expect a sort of doubling of the area burned by fire in the 2020s, tripling by the 2040s, quintupling by the 2080s. And that really, every time I quote that, the people who wrote the paper tell me I can't say it quintuples by the 2080s. And I say, but you put it in the paper and it was published, so how come I can't say it? And they say, well, we're not sure there'll be enough forest to burn. I'm sorry to say that here, but it scares me every day, okay? So the other thing that fire ecologists expect is increased risk of larger fires. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind ourselves here that one of the reasons we've seen fire increases, of course, is a response to past management practices. And for the ecosystems over here, they are fire adapted over millennia. And so when we talk about the problems of wildfire, we need to think about distinguish between the ecological impacts and the very, very real impacts on humans and communities. And sort of hold that duality in our head as we think about how to respond to these. Okay, okay, so now what I'm gonna do, since that was a whirlwind, but it was all sort of the major ways that climate change, the major levers that climate change is gonna pull on the region, I'm gonna briefly walk through each of the topic areas that the task force chose and talk about some of the ways that climate change is relevant to that area. But if you only remember one thing, remember this, that all of these things I'm about to talk about, our infrastructure, our recreation systems, our food and agriculture, all of these were created, developed, built with the past climate in mind, right? And so they're adapted, they're constructed, they're designed to succeed in the climate of the past. And the reason that climate change is problematic is that it is changing the climate to which we have built everything. And so it's that shifting that makes the challenge, and so we need to uncover the places where that shifting is going to make a problem. So when we think about infrastructure, we can think about our power systems that were designed to provide the amount of energy we typically needed in the places we typically needed it, using a pattern of streamflow that has typically occurred in the past. So we know all those things are likely to change or expected to change, and so that causes stress and some mismatches with our power system. We know that engineers design roads and bridges and culverts by looking at the streamflow that was observed over the past 30 or 50 years. That's the requirement. But that streamflow doesn't represent the streamflow that those roads, culverts, and bridges are going to have to deal with in the future. And so it's through those changes in, so the question is, how much do we recognize those changes and how much do we update our designs and plans to reflect them? Okay, so the next one, I'm going to talk about health and well-being. And there's many, many different ways that climate change can affect that, right? Through increasing infectious or vector-borne diseases. That's why there's a picture of the mosquito control truck. We've already talked about increases in wildfire, increases in temperature, heat waves increasing, number of hot days increasing, which is a problem for lots of people, especially folks who work outside. We also expect increases in harmful algal blooms. That's, I think, more in Puget Sound, but it can happen in some of our freshwater streams as well. So there's the sort of physical impacts, there's hazard impacts with floods, and there's mental health impacts as well that we need to be preparing for. The next slide, thinking about food and agriculture. So this is an interesting one because if there's enough water, many crops will do well or better in the short term because they're fertilized by CO2. The problem is that as warming continues, that improvement will actually diminish and reverse, and there'll be problems with yield and productivity. So in many places, it's different in every single location in the state and different crops, but in many places, it looks kind of okay if there's enough water until about the 2030s, and then after that, it's more problematic. But of course, there are different places, and there's many non-irrigated crops, which then will be affected by the changing patterns of temperature. And then with our irrigated crops, there may be a mismatch between the altered timing of supply and the altered timing of demand. We can think about lots of different ways that climate change can affect recreation, and snow sports is an easy one to think about. We also can think about fishing. As I mentioned, the expected stresses to cold water species. And increase invasive species or warm water fish, which is good or bad depending on what you're trying to fish for. One surprising to me, because I don't study game, but one surprising to me result of the National Climate Assessment was that some browsing animals, deer and elk, may do better in the short term under climate change because of the increased forage for them. It's also interesting to think about different timings of access, right? With the longer snow-free season, you can see increased desire to access the high country during times when we might have not typically hired the staff to patrol the high country or open the campgrounds, for example. Next slide. And then natural systems. We've already talked about forests and so that duality of our thinking about increasing fire risk. How do we return fire to those ecosystems while protecting our communities? We've already talked about salmon and freshwater ecosystems. There's many other wildlife, in particular those that are sensitive to or dependent on cold water or snow. And so two of those major ones that are relevant here, because they live nearby, are the wolverine and the lynx, which are both winter snow-dependent species and which are likely to be further stressed by climate change. Okay, so that was awful. And I'm always amazed I get invited back. But I think maybe I get invited back because I bring this part of the talk. And the part of the talk, which I'm not going to talk about, is what can we do, because that's what you're all going to talk about tonight, okay? But I want to just make sure you're aware of the vast amount of work that's going on in this state to prepare for these changes. And just to give you a sense, when I get on an airplane and I'm traveling for work, which I shouldn't do because there's fossil fuels involved, but we still live in a fossil fuel economy, so I do it. People ask me what I do, and I tell them what I do, and then they don't really want to talk to me anymore. And I insist that they listen, because I say, you know, there's something you don't know. There's a happy secret about climate change. And that happy secret is that there's people all across our communities and our governments who are taking this seriously. These threats, these very changes that I just outlined to you, they're very cognizant of. And they spend a lot of energy thinking about how does this affect my ability to protect the public, to provide the systems, goods, and services that we're expected to provide, and what do I need to do differently to make sure that I can, you know, what I'm supposed to do in my job can still happen in a changing environment. Don't worry, I set this so I would have 5 more minutes. So I haven't gone over that. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of stories about that, and these are just, there's more than this, but I try to pick out ones that are your neighbors, our neighbors, and some specific examples. And so, and each of these maps, although I don't know if the color scheme works in the back of the room, but each of these maps shows the land ownership pattern of the entities I'm talking about for the relative to the valley. So first I'm going to talk about the Park Service and the Forest Service. So a number of years ago, they collaborated. North Cascades Park, Mount Rainier Park, Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, and Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest, all in all about 6 million acres of public lands, collaborated to say what is going to happen, what are the vulnerabilities that we're facing as a result of climate change, and how should we start preparing for these across this entire landscape. So that's the Joint Vulnerability Assessment, Climate Change Vulnerability and Adaptation in the North Cascades region in Washington, which is an incredible resource. I also know that the Park Service is including information about the increasing risk of fire under climate change in their current fire management plan, and they've also done a bunch of work to assess climate change impacts on access through impacts on roads and trails, in large part through flooding and washouts. Forest Service doing many things as well, but one of the things that's especially exciting to me is that they're thinking about, and not just thinking about, they're incorporating climate-altered restoration targets, and I put restoration in quotes. When you think about restoring an ecosystem to its past condition, that may not make sense anymore because it may not be able to inhabit that past condition because the climate is now different than it was, and it will continue to change. So a quote from the strategy there is, we use the next warmer, drier ecological subregion as a proxy for reference conditions under climate change. Recognizing it's going to be warmer and drier, let's restore, I call it pre-store to that, so that the forest can thrive. So I'm going to talk about a number of different state agencies. The Department of Fish and Wildlife has been looking at climate resilient floodplain restoration. When they do floodplain restoration and they're putting in woody debris and other things, they actually say, well, the floods of the future are expected to be bigger So are we engineering this right so that it will still actually work in those floods, or is this stuff going to get washed away? The low flows of the future are going to be lower. Are we doing river restoration in a way that can accommodate and still protect salmon when the low flows are lower? This is awesome, but they learned this from you, Kent. Reintroducing upland beavers, right? So the idea is with decreased snow, we need many different ways to retain more water on the landscape up high, and beavers can do that. Increasing aquatic connectivity to think about as a priority way for protecting the cold water fish. Promoting climate resilient culverts. That sounds really boring. I get super excited about culverts because that's what I was talking about, engineers using the climate of the past. But we've built a tool where they can use the climate of the future to design their culverts. And DFW provides that tools to landowners to use in their own work as well. They've also have a series of different handouts. They've done pretty careful look at vulnerable species in the state of Washington, which species might be particularly vulnerable to climate change. Okay, go ahead. All right, so now DNR. So DNR is in the middle of developing an agency-wide climate resilience plan, looking at climate impacts on everything from their aquatic lands and buoy ducks, to their uplands, to their forested lands, to their leased lands. We're working closely with them to help them understand their risks and think about what to do about them. And in the process, they're also engaging with communities around the state. They had a workshop in Wenatchee a couple weeks ago to look at resilience issues in the Chelan and Wenatchee area and how they could partner with the community there to advance the community's work on resilience. Washington State Parks has assessed the vulnerability of all state parks to climate adaptation. And so it just maps some of the parks that are on this map area. Concerns aren't going to surprise you. They're worried about the shorter snow season. They're worried about flood damage to infrastructure and trails. They're worried about wildfire closures and damage. They're worried about climate change impacts on bugs and mosquitoes as well, in particular Lake Wenatchee for some reason. Okay? You should be proud of Washington State Department of Transportation. They were one of the first DOTs in the nation to assess the climate vulnerability of every piece of state-owned transportation infrastructure. And they did this going region by region around the state and talking to the people who worked on the ground about those roads and bridges and how they might be vulnerable to climate change. So they have a map of the whole state, all the state highways, railroads, airports, color coding them according to climate vulnerability. Green is not very vulnerable, yellow is medium, and red is pretty vulnerable to climate change. And they're looking at things like fire, flooding, sea level rise on the West Coast. They are changing their maintenance. They're thinking about hardening their infrastructure with steel guardrail posts and fire-prone areas. They're thinking about what they can do to decrease erosion because of the higher stream flows in rivers. And the next one is another DOT slide, which shows, yeah, you can't tell, but there's little dots of different colors on the roads. And this is because they have assessed all their fish passage barriers, right? So they got all these culverts and barriers to fish passage. They actually are required by law now to replace them. You gotta start, you can't do it all at once. So they're prioritizing the ones that are on the most vulnerable, climate vulnerable reaches of the highways, because a lot of that vulnerability comes from that exact same thing with the flooding. If they make bigger culverts, climate smart culverts, then they can increase the resilience of our roads. Your neighbors on the Colville have done some really interesting work. They did an assessment of 72 fish, wildlife, plant species that they really care about and how vulnerable they are to climate change. They also did a whole bunch of community outreach with a community brochure about what climate change means for the tribe and their lands, and they developed a youth activity and teaching guide that they're using. And those are really nice resources as well. Okay. All right, now let's get a little more local. I'm going to talk. So we got County of Chelan. They're doing a bunch of interesting things. Some of you know, I'm sure, about the Icicle Creek Working Group, which is attempting to bridge in and out of stream uses to address low summer flow issues on the Icicle Creek. They are using our science about how climate change will affect natural flows to test the solutions they're proposing. So they're trying to fix the low flows, and then they're asking, well, will that work in a changing climate? Is that enough? Do we need to do more? Their emergency management department has looked at how climate change worsens the hazards that the county is planning for. And then I think this is the last one of the neighbors, but looking at Chelan PUD, they've assessed climate risks to their operations, their power generation, their transmission lines. They're thinking about, they're using climate information in their operation of Lake Chelan. They're hardening their transmission infrastructure to fire. So this is way more exciting if you were closer, probably. It's probably a little washed out right now, but this is the map of all of those landowners and jurisdictions all together. These are your neighbors. They're building resilience for and with you, even if you didn't know it. You can learn from that. You can push them to do more. Think of this that they're doing without a lot of recognition. If you demanded that they do even more to make our community resilient, think of what they could accomplish. Okay. Skip this one, because I'm out of time. Let's go to the next one. So, our climate's already changed. It's gonna change more. It's taking us to a place that's unlike we have lived in the past, and it's unlike what our systems are designed to cope with. Our neighbors are doing a lot of work to prepare for this. We can learn from them, and we can work with them to build the future that we want. Thank you.
We will definitely invite you back.
Really happy to see the number of people that are in this room again today. I know that's been mentioned several times, but it means a lot to all of us in the valley here. Health and wellness, major impacts. You know this probably better than most across this country. The impacts of health and wellness in terms of heat-related stress, the smoke exposure, and the mental fatigue and stress that surrounds the disaster that we went through in 2014, 2015. What I'd like to do is just bring it to a very personal level. Over the last 5 years, our long-term recovery group has worked through many different cases over these 5 years, contacting and touching base with 1,600 different families and clients. Through that process, we just did our stats, we've lost 11.8% of those clients that have died, and literally all but 3 of their family members and neighbors have said it was due to the stress of these fires. What you need to understand is what you're not able to see, but you all know, and on a personal level, neighbor to neighbor, you see that. For 2.5 years, I had a gentleman come up to me and say, as I approached him, I said, how you doing? He and his family, a Hispanic family, lost everything after 50 years of being in this country, building that. He said, I want to be 6 feet under. 2.5 years, every single time I saw him. That's what he said to me. We fished him out of the Columbia River 2.5 years later, after the 2014 fires. What you need to understand is that this isn't just words. It's not just words. And it's time that we do something different to make a change. I know I only have 2 minutes, but I want you to understand what that really means. And empower yourselves to make a difference in this. Climate change, the more you do, the more control you have of your environments, and doing your firewise, doing your changes, the better you will do coping. We've seen it over the last 5 years. Please empower yourselves to make a difference.
Thank you. Terrace. Thank you very much. Next up is Rockland Cope, the town planner for Winthrop, who's going to talk a little bit about infrastructure and the quick highlights there.
Hello, I'm also delighted to see all these faces here tonight. I think this is a timely conversation that many of us have been waiting to have. And so I'm really grateful to the leadership that brought this about. I have been coming at this issue from the infrastructure standpoint, and I'm not going to quite get as personal as Carlene, but I think, again, we can all relate to the frustration of having our roads wash out. I think we had the fires, and the fires were the first wave, but then we had the mudslides and the road washouts, that continued even in the years after the fire had passed. So some of our infrastructure impacts that we've talked about in the task force are energy and the potential for disruption to our energy grid. And because we're hydropower dependent, the changes in the water availability and the timing of the peak flows could impact us, and there's a lot of nuance to that. It's not particularly my field of expertise, but I appreciate that it's a big challenge we could face. Transportation, obviously, our roads, we are in a valley where we have limited routes in and out of the valley, and we've kind of seen what happens when those major thoroughfares are affected, and that's how our goods and services come to us in the valley, and it's also how we send our waste out of the valley. So those are going to be important to consider. And then also, obviously, water. We all are water dependent. So much of, every facet of our life depends on water. So thinking about how the changes in water are going to be affected, and making sure that we've got enough to support our needs is going to be important. So again, grateful to participate in this conversation.
So I guess I'm here to tell you that climate change is going to have some especially big impacts for agriculture in the Methow Valley. Many of those impacts are fairly specific and somewhat subtle and might only be noticed by the folks whose livelihoods are deeply rooted in the land initially. But some of those impacts are already quite obvious. Climate change is already affecting and will continue to affect our agricultural soils and water resources. It will affect plant and animal health and productivity. It will affect farm profitability and farmer well-being. And I'm not going to go into examples now, but would encourage you to visit us over at the Ag Sector Station if you'd like to learn more about some of those specific impacts to agriculture in the Methow Valley. I guess what I do want to share with you now is that farmers and ranchers are under a lot of pressure, not only from the challenges of adapting to a changing climate, but also from the public, telling them how they should or should not farm in order to reduce their farm's carbon footprint or to help us all sink carbon back into the soil. And I believe that farms and ranches and orchards of all sizes, whether they're organic or conventional, have a really important positive role to play in this climate crisis if they're given the right tools and the right encouragement. And it's really important that as a community, we take the time to listen really carefully to our very diverse agriculturalists here, and learn what kind of support they need, what kind of support they each need from us to be able to both adapt to a changing climate and be part of building a resilient future. So I'm hopeful that that is part of what this process will accomplish.
And the food and ag section is over there. You can see there's a lot of panels and information to sink into in the next round. Next is Julie Tate with TwistWorks, touching on the impact on our economy from what we've learned here.
Hello. Yeah, I'm program director at TwistWorks. And so our task force basically, we know that tourism or a recreation-dependent economy is very vulnerable anyways, even in the best of cases. So obviously with climate change, there are going to be specific impacts on the economy. So some of the things that our team kind of highlighted, these are the impacts that we already see happening. So the first one is we have the shoulder season. We have earlier springs, later falls, less snow in the winter, fire episodes and smoke. And this affects when people come. People are coming earlier and they're coming later, but then we have this big deficit in the summertime. And that affects the job market. It's harder to find employees to cover the shoulder seasons, and it's harder to retain employees, obviously during fire episodes when everything shuts down. And this impacts the wages, and we know that people who work in the service industry are very vulnerable to any kind of wage impact, and their ability to survive on low-wage jobs is particularly vulnerable. And a lot of the service workers aren't able to leave during the smoke episodes, and so then they're stuck here being unemployed during the months of July or August. So it's really hard on the tourism economy, and we'd love to generate some ideas on diversity. One of the things at TwistWorks that we hear over and over again is that we need to diversify our economy. And so we're working with Riverville students and generating ideas on what that would look like. So I'd love to get some ideas from you tonight. And then the last impact that we talked about is that we have so much habitat loss and the trails impact. We have a lot more tours in very concentrated areas, and that obviously has a huge impact on those areas. And then we have a lot of woody debris and kind of a mess in some of the other trails. And that doesn't even go into obviously the lack of snow and what that's going to do to our wintertime economy and things like that. But these are the points that we have talked about that are impacting tourism already at this point. So we'd love to hear more from you.
Our last presenter is Laura Super from the Methow Valley Citizens Council, giving an overview of the impact on our natural systems.
This community cherishes our natural environment and wildlife. We can see that the ecosystems all around us are changing fast. We've already experienced the forces behind that. More droughts, more wildfires, more floods, bugs, and basically more unpredictability from season to season. So far, we've been discussing the human impacts of rapid changes to our natural systems. But how will the systems themselves be impacted? And since humans are selfish, what does that mean for us? Sudden and dramatic changes and extreme variability are better tolerated by some species than others. I'm not a scientist, and nobody on the natural systems subgroup is a scientist, but we're thankful for all the scientists in our community, so I can make some generalizations. When thousands of acres of forest burn or the snow melts across the high country too early, some wildlife can migrate or return, and some have to travel elsewhere or perish if they don't find the type of habitat that they need. As warming accelerates, new insects and diseases will challenge trees and forests because they can't get up and move. Some plants will fare better in a transition to a more arid climate, while some will fade away, and that will have implications across the entire food chain. Our salmon and other fish need clean, cold water at certain times of the year, and we wonder what warming streams and changing flows will mean for them. On top of all this, all natural systems are affected by the human presence on the landscape. Our constant expansion into every nook and cranny leaves little room and fewer resources for animals and plants to adapt. That makes land use decisions extra important. To the degree that we can help ease the burden of major changes on species, we have to try. And we are trying. I'm really heartened to see that everybody here is joining this effort. As Dr. Snover mentioned, many efforts are already underway to restore or manage landscapes to be more resilient. We're blessed with many experts and ologists who are working on big solutions already. Our work will require all of our expertise and willingness to keep looking at how our management of the land and water helps or harms species that are already under stress. We know some of what is happening across the landscape, but this workshop presents a chance to put the pieces together. So I encourage everybody to walk around, find the low-hanging fruit, and help us prioritize solutions. Thank you.
All right, now this is your chance to engage in this whole process and go from listening to talking and sharing and providing your input.